January 17, 1940. Peenemünde, Baltic Coast. ***. The wind cuts across the frozen marshland like a blade. Snow gathers in the corners of concrete bunkers half buried in sand dunes. Inside a windowless assembly hall, beneath arc lights that hum and flicker, a small group of men in long coats stand before something that does not yet have a name. It is 25 feet long, white as bone, shaped like a cigar with fins. No propeller. No cockpit. No wings in the traditional sense. One engineer places his gloved hand on the cold steel skin and feels the future beneath his fingertips.
This is not an airplane.
This is not artillery. It is something else entirely. A marriage of chemistry and velocity, rage and mathematics. Outside, seagulls circle the compound. They do not know that in this frozen place, beneath the indifferent sky, the rulebook of warfare is being rewritten. For centuries, war had been a contest of muscle and metallurgy, swords, cannons, rifles, tanks. Men aimed. Men fired. Men died within sight of one another. But Nazi Germany, squeezed between the anvil of Soviet manpower and the hammer of British resolve, was running out of time and territory. Innovation became a religion. Desperation bred genius, and genius bred monsters. The Third Reich did not merely want to win the war. It wanted to win it in a way that would shatter the enemies well before the first soldier crossed the border. And so, in laboratories and forests, in underground factories and coastal testing grounds, German scientists conjured weapons that seemed pulled from the pages of science fiction. Rockets that screamed across the stratosphere. Jets that broke the sound barrier. Bombs guided by invisible hands. Weapons so advanced that even the men who built them sometimes doubted their own eyes. These were not the tools of a confident empire. They were the fevered dreams of a regime that knew, deep in its bones, that it was losing. The German war machine in 1940 was a predator at the height of its power. France fell in 6 weeks. Poland was crushed in a month. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had proven that speed and coordination could shatter armies that held their ground for generations. Panzer tanks rolled across Europe like iron locusts. Stuka dive bombers shrieked out of the clouds, their sirens engineered to induce terror. For a moment, it seemed as though the Reich had discovered a formula for invincibility. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. German industry could not match the output of American factories. The Luftwaffe, though feared, was losing pilots faster than they could be replaced. The Soviet Union was a land too vast to conquer, a population too large to subdue. Hitler's generals knew this. His scientists knew this. And so they turned to the only advantage they had left, ingenuity fueled by fanaticism. What the soldiers expected was victory delivered by superior morale, superior training, superior will. What they got instead were machines that barely worked, weapons that killed as many of their operators as their enemies, and miracles that arrived too late. The V-1 flying bomb, Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1, was born out of desperation and spite. By 1943, the Allies were bombing German cities into ash and rubble. Hamburg burned. Cologne burned. Berlin itself was being hollowed out block by block. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend German skies. Conventional bombers were too slow, too vulnerable, too expensive in fuel and human life. The solution, as envisioned by engineer Robert Lusser and Fritz Goslau, was elegant in its cruelty: a pilotless plane loaded with explosives, powered by a pulse-jet engine, launched from a rail, and aimed at London. The first V-1 test flight took place on Christmas Eve, 1942. It flew for 60 seconds before plunging into the sea. Engineers cheered anyway. By June 1944, the weapon was operational. Launch sites dotted the French and Dutch coasts, simple ramps hidden in forests, disguised as barns or farmhouses. A V-1 could be assembled in hours. It required no pilot, no landing gear, no radio guidance. You aimed it. You lit it. You walked away. The pulse jet engine gave it a sound unlike anything heard before, a guttural, rhythmic growl that Londoners would come to call the buzzbomb, or doodlebug. When you heard it, you were safe. When the sound stopped, you had 15 seconds before the warhead detonated. Between June and October 1944, Germany launched more than 10,000 V-1s at England. They killed over 6,000 civilians. They destroyed entire streets, flattened hospitals, erased homes. But they did not break British morale, and they did not alter the course of the war. The V-1 was a weapon of terror, not strategy. It had no precision, no intelligence. It was a flying grenade hurled blindly at a city, and cities are large. For every V-1 that struck a factory or airfield, 10 more landed in empty fields or exploded mid-flight due to mechanical failure. The Reich had invented the cruise missile, but it had not invented a reason for it to matter. German engineers did not stop. They refined. They escalated. They built faster. The V-2 rocket was something else entirely. Where the V-1 was crude, the V-2 was elegant. Where the V-1 crawled through the air at 400 miles per hour, the V-2 ascended to the edge of space and fell at 3 times the speed of sound. No one heard it coming. No one saw it coming. By the time the explosion arrived, the rocket had already been traveling for 5 minutes from launch sites in Holland or Germany, arcing high above the clouds, beyond the reach of any interceptor. It was the world's first ballistic missile, and it was unstoppable. Its architect was Wernher von Braun, a man with the face of a schoolteacher and the ambitions of a prophet. He did not dream of vengeance. He dreamed of the stars. To von Braun, the V-2 was not a weapon, it was a test vehicle for spaceflight, forced into military service by a regime that saw only enemies in craters. But he built it anyway. And thousands died for his dream. The V-2 stood 46 feet tall. It weighed 13 tons, most of it liquid ethanol and oxygen, chemicals so volatile that fueling the rocket was a gamble with death. The engine burned for 60 seconds, producing 56,000 pounds of thrust. The missile rose vertically, then tilted toward its target, accelerating until the fuel ran out. Gravity and momentum did the rest. At impact, the warhead, 1 ton of amytal explosive, arrived with the force of a meteor. Buildings did not collapse. They disintegrated. More than 3,000 V-2s were launched during the war. They struck London, Antwerp, Paris, Lille. They killed an estimated 9,000 people. But they cost more to build than they destroyed. Each rocket required thousands of man-hours, precision components, rare fuels, and expertise that Germany could not afford to waste. The factory that produced them, Mittelwerk, buried in the Harz Mountains, was staffed by concentration camp prisoners who were worked to death in tunnels lit by oil lamps. More prisoners died building the V-2 than the V-2 killed in combat. It was a weapon of the future deployed by a regime that had no future. The soldiers and engineers who worked on the V-2 believed they were creating a miracle. They spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. Some called it the wonder weapon that would force the Allies to negotiate. Others knew better. One engineer, after watching a successful test launch, wrote in his diary, "The rocket worked perfectly, except it landed on the wrong planet." He was executed for defeatism 3 months later. But the Third Reich was not finished. Desperation has no ceiling. In the autumn of 1944, a Messerschmitt Me 262 streaked across the sky above Bavaria at 540 miles per hour, a speed no piston engine fighter could match. It had no propeller. Instead, twin turbojet engines hung beneath swept wings, engines that roared with a sound like tearing steel. Allied pilots, accustomed to dogfighting at 300 miles per hour, watched in disbelief as the Me 262 simply outran them. Bullets fell uselessly behind. The jet climbed, banked, vanished. It was as though the Germans had invented a new dimension of flight.
The Me 262 was not just fast.
It was lethal. Armed with 4 30mm cannons, it could shred a bomber in a single pass. Luftwaffe aces who flew it described the experience as intoxicating, like riding lightning. One pilot said, "You do not dogfight in a 262. You execute." Had the Me-262 been deployed in large numbers earlier in the war, it might have delayed the Allied bombing campaign by months. But it was not. Hitler himself delayed production by demanding the jet be converted into a bomber, a role it was never designed for. By the time Me-262s reached operational squadrons in 1944, Germany had no fuel, no trained pilots, and no time. Fewer than 200 saw combat. They shot down over 500 Allied planes. But it was a pinprick against a tidal wave. German pilots who flew the 262 expected to be heroes. What they experienced instead was terror. The engines were fragile, prone to flameouts and compressor stalls. Landings were a gamble. The jet was too fast, too heavy, and Allied fighters learned to simply wait near German airfields and shoot the 262s down as they slowed to land. One pilot, Kurt Welter, became the world's first jet ace. He survived the war and said, "We were gods for 10 minutes at a time. The rest was prayer." Across the Atlantic, American engineers studied captured German rockets, jets, and blueprints with the intensity of priests reading forbidden scripture. The technological gap was undeniable. The United States had entered the war with mass production, not innovation. American factories built 50,000 Sherman tanks, not because the Sherman was the best tank, but because it could be built quickly and in vast numbers. American bombers like the B-17 and B-24 were reliable, sturdy, but not revolutionary. What America had was abundance. What Germany had was genius without resources. But genius without resources is just a blueprint. In the final months of the war, as Allied troops pushed into Germany from both east and west, they discovered entire underground cities dedicated to the production of wonder weapons. In the Harz Mountains, they found metalwork, where the V-2 was born in darkness. In Bavaria, they found wind tunnels and test facilities for jets that would not fly for another decade. In Peenemünde, they found the remnants of a rocket program that had achieved spaceflight before any nation on Earth. And in the Black Forest, they found plans, thousands of pages of plans, for weapons that never made it past the drawing board. There was the Horten Ho 229, a jet-powered flying wing coated in charcoal and sawdust to absorb radar, an early attempt at stealth technology. There was the Landkreuzer P-1000 Rat, a proposed super-heavy tank that would have weighed 1,000 tons and required a crew of 20. It was never built. There was the Sun Gun, a theoretical space-based mirror that would focus sunlight into a beam capable of igniting cities. There was the V-3 Supergun, a multi-chamber cannon buried in a hillside in France, designed to shell London from 200 miles away. Allied bombers destroyed it before it fired a single shot. These were not the tools of a regime preparing for victory. They were the fevered dreams of men who refused to admit defeat. The symbolic object that runs through this story is not food or abundance. It is the blueprint. Every wonder weapon began as ink on paper, a vision of dominance sketched by men who believed they could outthink reality. The blueprint represented the Reich's final ideology, that intelligence and will could substitute for resources and humanity. But blueprints do not stop tanks. Blueprints do not feed armies. And blueprints do not win wars when the factories that would build them are rubble and the workers who would staff them are dead. American soldiers who entered German research facilities in 1945 expected to find weapons. What they found instead were museums of ambition. Rocket engines that had never been fired. Jet prototypes that had never flown. Diagrams for submarines that could cross the Atlantic without surfacing, for bombers that could reach New York, for missiles that could be launched from the moon. One American intelligence officer, standing in a warehouse filled with V-2 components, wrote, "They built the future, but they built it in hell." Wernher von Braun surrendered to American forces in May 1945. He was 33 years old. He carried with him notebooks, blueprints, and a desperate hope that his genius would earn him clemency.
It did.
Within months, von Braun and over 100 German scientists were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, their Nazi pasts quietly erased, their expertise repurposed. Von Braun would go on to design the Saturn V rocket that carried Americans to the moon. The V-2 The weapon that killed thousands became the foundation of NASA's space program. The Me-262 jet fighter influenced the design of the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15, the jets that would dominate the Korean War. The Horton flying wing inspired the B-2 stealth bomber. Every wonder weapon, no matter how monstrous its origin, was dissected, studied, and reborn in the hands of the victors. But the Reich's greatest technological achievements could not save it. The V-1 and V-2 killed civilians, but did not halt the Allied advance. The Me-262 shot down bombers, but could not protect German cities. The superweapons were marvels of engineering deployed by a regime that had already lost the war. They were solutions to problems that no longer mattered, answers to questions no one was asking. What the German soldiers and scientists expected was a reversal of fortune, a sudden, dramatic shift in momentum that would justify the suffering, the sacrifice, the unthinkable cost. What they experienced instead was the slow, grinding realization that no weapon, no matter how advanced, could compensate for moral bankruptcy and strategic madness. The Reich had built rockets that touched space, but it could not build trust. It had designed jets faster than sound, but it could not outrun the consequences of its choices. In the ruins of Berlin, in the spring of 1945, Soviet soldiers found the remains of the Führer bunker. In one room, they discovered maps marked with launch trajectories for V-2 rockets aimed at Moscow and New York. In another, they found blueprints for intercontinental bombers that would never be built. In a third, they found a typewriter and a half-written speech about the inevitable triumph of the Aryan will. The man who had ordered the creation of these weapons was already dead, a bullet through his skull, his body burned in a shallow pit. The wonder weapons had shocked the world, but they had not saved their creators. The epilogue of this story is not written in steel or fire. It is written in the choices made after the smoke cleared. The United States, having witnessed the power and terror of German innovation, chose not to abandon it, but to claim it. The scientists who built the V-2 in tunnels lined with corpses were given new labs, new budgets, new lives. The blueprints that had once aimed at London were retooled to aim at the stars. The jet engines that had once screamed over burning cities were refined to carry passengers across oceans. But there is a shadow that follows every innovation born in cruelty. The Saturn V that launched Apollo 11 was built by a man who had once stood in Middlework and watched prisoners die. The stealth bombers that patrol American skies carry the genetic code of aircraft designed to terrorize cities. The cruise missiles, the drones, the precision-guided weapons that define modern warfare, all of them trace their lineage back to a frozen testing ground on the Baltic Sea, where men in long coats stood before a white rocket and believed they were building the future. They were. But it was not the future they imagined. The lesson of the Third Reich's wonder weapons is not that technology wins wars. It is that technology, no matter how advanced, is only as moral as the hands that wield it. The V-2 did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was built by slaves for a cause that deserved to lose. The Me-262 did not fail because it was slow. It failed because it arrived in the hands of a regime that had already burned its own future to ash. Freedom cannot be engineered. Democracy cannot be calculated. Abundance is not a formula. It is a choice, made every day, by societies that value human life over human ambition. The Reich's scientists were brilliant. But brilliance without wisdom is just a sharper blade pointed at the wrong throat. In the end, the most advanced weapons in the world could not stop the tide of soldiers who believed in something greater than conquest. The rockets fell silent. The jets rusted in fields. The blueprints were filed away in archives, studied by historians and engineers who would build a different world. And the wind still cuts across Peenemünde, over the empty bunkers and cracked concrete, over the place where the future was born in darkness. The seagulls still circle. The waves still crash. And if you listen closely, in the spaces between the wind, you can hear the echo of an engine that burned too bright and too briefly, a sound like distant thunder, like a promise that was never kept. That is the story of the secret Nazi weapons that shocked the world. Not because they succeeded, but because they revealed the limits of genius divorced from humanity. Not because they changed the outcome of the war, but because they changed what came after. They were miracles of engineering and monuments to madness, built by men who believed that intelligence alone could substitute for morality. They were wrong, and the world, having learned that lesson in blood and fire, moved on.